Got a sec. So the R3 for the techniques.
This is being broadcast over the county TV network, and it's also going to be a YouTube video available indefinitely. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Rich Cassell. He's a recently retired USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service employee, formerly known as the Soil Conservation Service, who served as an NRCS Natural Resource Conservationist for nearly 43 years. Sure. Sorry. Too much coffee today. 43 years in Monterey Bay area of California. Rich is a certified professional erosion and sediment control specialist and has been since 1982. He has extensive erosion and sediment control planning and on-the-ground experience, having served thousands of land users and their needs on a wide variety of land use, including urban landscapes. He has served on many natural disaster details to other areas of the state following fire, storm, flood, earthquake disasters, and most recently in an NRCS contractor role on the 2017 Wine Country fires and our recent 2017-18 Thomas fire and debris flow disaster in Montecito. He's been instrumental in forwarding erosion control and land restoration programs at the local, state, and national level. He co-founded the Erosion Control Certification Program more than 35 years ago. Rich has a Bachelor's of Science degree in Natural Resource Management from Humboldt State, and he was born and raised here in Santa Barbara, where he attended San Marcos High and Santa Barbara City College. He started his career with the NRCS in Santa Barbara in 1974. I'd like to welcome Rich to the podium.
Thank you, Jeff, very much for that introduction. Happy to be here back in my hometown. As Jeff said, I went to school here and then transferred to Humboldt State and started work with the Natural Resources Conservation Service in 1974 when we used to have a Santa Barbara office. Our Santa Barbara County office now is in Santa Maria. I'm recently retired, as Jeff said, but the Natural Resources Conservation Service is a federal agency under the U.S. Department of Agriculture, non-regulatory. We like to think that we're unbiased because we don't sell anything, we don't do the work, we don't, basically help people make informed decisions and not make them for them. For agricultural producers, we have a number of different financial assistance programs. So if any of you have agricultural crops or lands that were damaged from the fire debris flow, there may be some financial assistance help there as well. We work with a lot of partnering organizations, including counties and water resource agencies, Forest Service, CAL FIRE, resource conservation districts, and others. And here we basically have offices in almost every county in California. And as I mentioned, Santa Maria is the closest office for Santa Barbara County. It's kind of interesting that back in 1964, I lived in the Mission Canyon area of Santa Barbara County, and we had a terrible wildfire called the Coyote Fire back in 1964. And it was something that motivated me as a young man to want to get into land restoration. And here I am, full circle, coming back and assisting fire victims in the Salmas Fire, some of the area that burned in the Coyote Fire as well. In 1982, in Santa Cruz County, where I live now, we had a storm that delivered our entire seasonal precipitation in one day. We had 2 feet of water in one day, and a debris flow hit my house. It didn't destroy it, but I know what it feels like to live through a debris flow. So both from being evacuated from fire and having a debris flow hit my house, and being a land and water restoration person, I feel like I have something that I can offer folks. Not to mention the 43 years of experience as a field person, meeting with thousands of residents on their properties and giving them helpful advice. In the fires that we've had just in the last 6 months in the wine country and here in Santa Barbara, Ventura County, I visited probably over 200 different properties giving assistance. The Natural Resource Conservation Service, it's a free service, so there was no charge for our services. All the publications back here that are from me or from the RCD or from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, I wrote for the agency, and just recently the California Native Plant Society, I've been working with them since November on this fire recovery guide. So those publications have a wealth of information in them and some really good, helpful tips and advice as you go forward with any of your recovery restoration activities on your properties. So here we go. Overview. Some of the things I just want to mention. I want to certainly leave enough time for questions since we have a small enough group that will be able to hopefully answer, your questions tonight. But when we look at recommendations and strategies and treatments and what do you do, what don't you do, we first have to start off with a post-fire assessment, looking at the site conditions, looking at potential issues and impacts. before we jump the gun, so to speak. And then we talk about strategies, sort of overarching ideas on how to address the situation. Then we get down to individual practices or no practices. And the fire safe landscape tips I'm going to leave for Sabrina's presentation, but I have a few in the slideshow that I'll go over very briefly. And then I'll end with my top 10. So looking at, well, this goes pretty quick here. So assessing a site before deciding treatment is really important. So fire history, when was the last time the watershed burned, the property burned, anything in the neighborhood burned? Knowing what the fire history is important to know what we had there before and how long it's been since it burned. The fire intensity is extremely important in terms of replanting, whether you want to seed or plant or whatever you want to do in the way of disturbing the soil. It's good to know whether or not it was a high intense burn, moderate, or a light burn. Then the degree of disturbance as well. On some properties, you had a lot of fire crews and damage that was caused from the firefighting effort. So we want to assess those damages, and they may just be from the property owner's damages as well. Structural loss and debris issues, if structures were lost on the property. Slope stability, if the property is on any kind of slope. The erosion and sediment hazard, and each site's going to be different depending on the soil type, depending on the length and the percent slope, its proximity to a water course, other things that may affect the slope stability, like road cuts, house cuts, and agricultural operations, if there's terraces, anything where a slope has been compromised in the past, we need to evaluate those conditions. Looking at tree hazards, trees that may still fall as a result of being damaged by fire or burned by fire, and road and drainage systems. So some of the site conditions, as I mentioned, soil type, hydrophobic conditions of the soil on whether or not that fire has caused the situation to allow increased runoff because of volatilization of the gases that actually cause the soil to reach kind of a impermeable level below the surface. The topography, not just whether or not it's on a hill or not, but what is the landform and how is that shaped and what is the aspect, and where's the sun come up, how long is the slope, what was there before, the microclimate of the property. Streams and water courses, even if they're not on the property, is important. Many people in Montecito that I met with said, the nearest creek was like 6 blocks away, and yet we had a creek go, take our house out basically with the debris flow issues. The water resources and supply, whether or not those have been affected. Fish and wildlife. The plant community that was there, understanding what plants were there, the types of plants. But particularly, whether or not you had important natives there or you had invasive plants, it's good to know what might come back from what was there before. And then there may be cultural resources. T&E is threatened and endangered species, so it's quite the gamut of variables and conditions that we'll look at. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Back, it goes back. There we go. Oops. So additionally, following fire, we always have the hazard of trees falling, rocks falling. Many areas have a lot of exposed rocks we didn't see. They were buried by the vegetation. So rock rocks are there perched on the landscape, can easily mobilize. So rock fall is an issue on some sites that we look at. Obviously, debris flows, mudslides, slope instability issues. Some of these issues we can see after a fire because we can see the landscape now without the vegetation there. So a trained eye can kind of almost, I don't want to say predict, but, you know, with a fairly good level of confidence, say if you had a debris flow, mudslide or landslide situation, where would that likely occur? Soil erosion, stream bank erosion, and ground subsidence is a little bit of an issue where root systems and tree trunks and things where high intensity burns occurred, burned under the ground. I mean, just walking the landscape, you know, I've fallen into knee deep into caverns. And in one case, I almost fell into a septic tank. It was an old redwood septic tank. And then downstream flooding can still be an issue. I noticed from other presentations we've made that a lot of people come out because they're concerned about, you know, increased flooding and slide debris flow, runoff drainage issues as a result of all their neighboring properties being affected by the fire. So not to go over this in a lot of detail, but these are all potential issues that are real issues following fire. And we saw all of these things in Santa Barbara County and I'm sure in Montecito. So some of the issues in agriculture, include crop damage, infrastructure damage, irrigation systems, fence lines, culverts, damage to irrigation water quality and water sources and supply. And once again, as I mentioned, the natural resources does assist our agricultural producers with technical assistance, design assistance, planning assistance, and financial assistance to put some of that infrastructure back on the landscape. Some of the biggest issues, though, that I find when working with landowners and contractors is a landowner's ability to understand and install needed corrective protective post-fire measures properly, and even if they're even necessary, and to perform necessary maintenance. I found a lot of folks copying basically what their neighbor was doing. In some cases, the neighbor may have done the right thing, but it might not be right for you. In other cases, the neighbor was doing the wrong thing, and everyone started copying the wrong thing. Similarly, a contractor's ability to understand and install needed corrective protective measures properly, and if even necessary as well, and to provide any needed follow-up. You know, and I worked with a lot of contractors who are very open to advice, and others felt like with all their years of experience doing it, they didn't need any more help, but I saw them clearly install measures improperly. And unfortunately, in some cases, it would make the situation worse, not better. The straw wattles, the fiber rolls, probably more than 50% of them were installed improperly. The same holds true with netting, like this netting here, the jute netting, and then straw wattles placed on top of it. You know, it's totally overkill, but the straw wattles are not in contact with the soil. They're just sitting on top of the netting, so they really aren't doing a thing. So, but someone sees this after they've had a fire and they feel like they've done as much as they can, yet it's kind of just a sort of a smoke screen. So that ends up being one of the biggest issues, that the practices are in some cases not even needed, or they're installed incorrectly. Again, giving folks a false sense of security, which is, for me, is worse than knowing that you have a hazard, than doing something and then making it worse or making you feel you don't have a problem anymore. But saying that, a lot of the contractors, I think are well-intended. They might not have known. There may have clearly been some from out of town that were looking to make some money. But nonetheless, the information is needed in the expertise and the professions that are assisting fire victims or debris flow victims on their property. So some of the recovery strategies, I like to start off with do nothing. Turns out to be a really big practice, but one that nobody really considers that seriously because they feel helpless if they do nothing. But as I mentioned, nothing sometimes can be the best solution, particularly if you had an area that was had a low intensity burn. Everything is still in the ground. The root systems are still there. Things are going to resprout, regenerate. By tearing all that out and starting over with a brand new plant is not a better thing than already having a root system intact. Any disturbance to the ground, makes it more susceptible to soil erosion processes. So working with nature, understanding the natural processes, working with those natural processes is what I try to walk through a property owner or a contractor working with a property owner so that less becomes more in many cases. And very important is that one size does not fit all, that there isn't just one formula that everybody needs to follow on their property because there are so many variables on each property. No two properties generally have the same soil types, lengths of slope, types of vegetation, drainage patterns, and I can go on and on. So coordinating efforts with neighbors, and sometimes it's a great way to meet your neighbors. I know going through the Loma Prieta earthquake in Santa Cruz County, we had damage from earthquake too, but I met neighbors that I, lived on the same street with for many years, but it took a disaster for us all to come together. But this is really important when you're recovering from a disaster, is to work on a neighborhood level, particularly if it's a debris flow or a fire or something like that. What you just do on your property generally is not enough. You need to be looking at the bigger picture, kind of have a neighborhood plan or a community plan or a street plan. So that every situation's a little bit different. If you happen to be on a stream, even more important. Spot treatment on a stream can get you into more trouble if you're not careful. And there are many agencies that are out there, like the Natural Resources Conservation Service, that don't charge you anything. We don't have a vested interest. We're unbiased. We help you make decisions, and there's helpful information to get you started. There's certified professionals. There's working with licensed, experienced contractors is also important. Some cases, some permits and approvals may also be necessary. So again, some global strategies is don't disturb potentially unstable slopes and don't cover with plastic. And I'm not quite sure, how many landowner plastic projects there were or how many landowners got contractors to cover their slopes with plastic, but it's almost always the wrong thing to do. Plastic basically increases runoff and it retains moisture in the slope, so it kind of defeats the whole idea of dewatering a slope and reducing runoff. It also, most people use black plastic. It kills everything underneath the plastic and can sterilize the soil if left on long enough. Don't block water courses, and it's common to take dead or burned material and sidecast it over a bank, thinking that you might be able to help soil erosion in a stream bank by putting loose brush or burned material in those areas, but they tend to become debris jams later or cause deflections of water and can make the problem worse. So runoff and drainage control is considering the 4S formula for runoff management: to slow it, to sink it, to spread it, to store it. Too often, the first thing we think of is divert it. So we need to use diversions cautiously, because when you divert runoff, you control runoff. And when you control runoff, you control nature. And that never ends well. We really need to be working with nature, but diversions are one of the most common things that we think of after, fire or storm, is where do we move the water? And when we do that, we concentrate the water. We accumulate more in one place, and then we have a disposal issue. And a lot of times we divert the problem at the same time. Different ways of slowing it, sinking it, spreading it, but I have a publication almost by that name that came out of Santa Cruz County. My card or my information is on the slideshow at the end. I'd be happy to at least send you an electronic copy of that, but it's a great publication on drainage around your home and property and how to do all these things in a manageable way. So I'm breaking the treatment practices down into short term, which would be the first few years following wildfire; permanent practices, which would be long term, will be staying on the landscape for many years to come; and then emergency. Sometimes emergency practices might only be for 1 or 2 storms, and it might just be for the first winter following fire. I almost consider next year as our first winter following fire, since we had our fire down here this winter. And so you generally want to be prepared for at least 2 winters following fire, maybe even 3 to 5, just depending on the nature of the fire. But just getting through 1 winter following fire is generally not enough. A case in point is the Oakland fires, 1991, 92, early 90s. The second year following fire was way more disastrous than the first winter following fire in the Oakland Hills. So it all depends on how we receive the rainfall as well, but it takes longer than a few months for the landscape to completely restore itself before, the fire. So give nature a chance, but work with her, and but be prepared. The emergency practices have a much higher risk and generally have more maintenance associated with them. So if you put an emergency practice on the ground, you need to be prepared for its limitations and the maintenance responsibilities that go along with that, including such things as sandbags, straw wattles, and the like. So some of the things that nature provides to us without us getting too far ahead of the curve is, generally speaking, there's leaf drop, where you still have plants that either had heat damage or the tree or the brush still had leaves on it or had plant parts that are dropping to the ground and are laying on the ground to give some protection to the soil. You can see in this picture quite a bit of protection. To go back and put mulch on top of mulch, you would be probably not be doing a service to the environment. You think, well, more is better. No, less is better, because you don't want mulch too deep. You want plants to regenerate. You want seed to come back through it. But if you have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 inches of mulch on it, nothing's going to come through that. You're basically preventing and slowing down the regeneration process. So a raindrop hits the soil at about 35 miles an hour and displaces soil particles 5 feet in any given direction. So anything that raindrop hits first is going to take the power and the energy out of that raindrop, and there'll be less erosive effect it will have on the soil. Mulch slash lop and scatter is something that is done usually on fire breaks, fuel breaks, trails that were built by firefighters to cover the bare disturbed soil following fire from using materials there on site. In some ways that can be done on private properties as well, but as I said, the first golden rule is to limit soil disturbances, and you don't have to be so quick to remove blackened vegetation or vegetation you're uncertain of as to whether or not it's still alive or not. Leave everything there. Just stepping on the ground can disrupt the soil enough that you'll actually be putting air back into the soil by disrupting the surface soil. Anytime you do that, the air fills with water and it's more liable to move. The ash actually has some effect on absorbing runoff. So initially, the first few storms, the ash is going to absorb some of the rainfall. Natural stone, gravel, and rock, anything that the raindrop hits that's not bare soil is a form of mulch. It's a form of a protective cover for the soil. So assessing what's going on there naturally, there may not even be a need to place any additional cover on the soil immediately after fire. So, but usually I like to start with mulch. If we don't have the mulch, then what can we use? Straw mulch is one of the preferred, mulches. I try to recommend a weed-free source or a rice straw, particularly in any wildland interface. So if there was any weed seed or any non-native seed in the straw, that you wouldn't be spreading it out into a natural area. I know in Northern California there's quite an abundance of rice straw. I heard that it was a little bit more difficult to get here in the Thomas Fire area. But again, it's less is more. You only need 2 inches. You don't need 4 inches. Everyone says, well, it's so cheap. I mean, let's put 6 inches on it. You don't need to. I mean, optimal is 1.5 to 2 inches. Wood chips, on the other hand, are going to tie up nitrogen in the soil. It's going to slow regeneration down. It's okay in the landscape as long as it doesn't get too thick. Up in the Santa Rosa area, they had such a program of wood chip use in the neighborhoods that it actually fueled the fire in many cases. It actually was like kindling when they had buildup of 6 to 8 inches of wood chips in some of these housing developments up there that were burned. Compost is a form of protection, surface protection, and it also provides some nutrition for the soil and plant materials. Gravel mulches, and then hydromulch. We saw some of this. It's expensive. It may inhibit some natural regeneration. There are clearly some advantages in covering areas quickly, particularly areas that are inaccessible or where you don't want to have that foot traffic or that disturbance, that you can spray, the hydromulch, which is actually a mixture of a tackifier, fiber, water, seed, maybe seed. They don't always have seed and fertilizer. Sometimes it's just the mulch material and not seed in it. Seed is a very site-specific call. We almost never recommend seeding. When we do, it's usually native grass, and usually it's going to be good for the second season following the fire, not the first season, because native grasses are slower to germinate. Many of them are permanent or perennial. And this is a very site-specific call as well. So, I mean, I would get professional advice and not necessarily from a hydromulch contractor before you consider hydromulching. You may only need some loose straw. the fiber rolls and straw wattles in a lot of places, and I don't know, Santa Barbara County as well, they were actually giving these away to folks. I know they were doing it up in Sonoma and Napa County, but they were going on the landscape like crazy, and like I said, in most cases not done properly. This particular job was actually done properly. The straw wattles actually dug into the soil so that water and sediment doesn't go underneath it. It has to be forced through it. It's staked at 4-foot intervals. But the improper part of this job is that they put it on a relatively flat landscape in the lawn. Didn't burn for the most part, and several rolls of them. But just what you see there, what do we have? Maybe 150 feet total. That cost the landowner $5,000, and that whole job probably a couple of hours to install. The wattle's usually $1 a foot to purchase. So clearly, quite a few folks were being taken advantage of. I spoke to this person. I spoke to the neighbor. The neighbor was going to have the same job done on their property, and I told him that he didn't need to do this, and so he didn't. And I think the contractor got pretty upset. So erosion control blankets and netting, you see an extensive use of this, even here, not just up in the wine country, but almost always I saw it without anything placed underneath it. Not only that, it was kind of tinted over the surface, so it was like draped over the surface if you looked at it really carefully. It has to have clear surface connection. It has to be intact with the soil. It can't be elevated over the soil. The netting is there to hold mulch in place. By itself, it doesn't have the value. I'm not going to say it has no value. It has some value. Anytime you put anything on the surface, it's going to give it some protection. The unfortunate thing is that many of the people that installed the netting removed all of the vegetation from fairly steep slopes and then put something back that really was going to have, I'm going to say, probably less effect in some cases. Certainly not any better than if they would have just left things alone. Anyway, it can be an expensive insurance and not always, yeah. So seeding and revegetation, I'm going to leave some of the revegetation for Sabrina's presentation, but following fire, and I've already mentioned this, wait for nature. Some pruning may be in order, and seeding grass is very site specific. There are grasses that are non-reseeding annuals, even though they're not natives, that can be used in specific places that germinate very quickly. And in the Thomas fire, we'd be looking at cereal grains because we have a December, January fire. Most anything else is warm season. Nothing will germinate in the middle of the winter very well. It'll be very slow at best. But the cereal grains will grow fast in cold weather. So there's a chance that you can get some protection with seed. Now, saying that, a slope that has potential for failure or debris flow, seeding grass on it is not going to help it, even if you get a good stand of grass, because grasses increase infiltration. So in a mudslide situation, you want less water in the slope, not more water in the slope. So it's really a site-specific call. Minimizing the tree cutting is important, and not to be too quick to remove fire-damaged plants that they may just look worse than they are. We're already seeing quite a bit of regeneration. We were seeing it within a few weeks following the fire. And when you think about it, a plant, particularly a tree that has this extensive root system of the ground, if it's basically undamaged, if the tree's not dead, even if the tree did burn down, you still have the root systems there holding and binding the soil and the whole soil mantle together. By removing that and starting over with grass or new plants in a pot or something, you're not going to have the same effect. So becomes more of a problem with every fire that we have. There just seems to be more invasive plants, and unfortunately, I guess, they don't always have better root systems than our native plants do for erosion and slope protection, but they can also take over plants that are better for slope protection and ones that are going to be better in the long term. Because we don't just want the plants to return to the landscape, we want the animals and the insects and the whole ecosystem to return. So we try to reduce the amount of invasion from the exotic plants and non-natives as much as possible. And the easiest way to do that is to get them when the populations are small, when you first recognize them coming back following fire, because they will delay natural recovery as well. There's two lists of plants that I left as handouts in the back that I've worked with California Native Plant Society with over the last 10 years. And with each fire, we keep trying to fine-tune that list. The one on native plants is still subject to revision, but it's getting close now. The publication in the back on the fire rate recovery guide also has some really good information in it, and also helped with the development of that publication too. So it helps give you an idea of not just plants that have some fire resistance, but these are plants that are also good for erosion control, slope stability. They're drought tolerant, less water using plants. So our drainage treatments is huge after fire, because so many of our drainage systems were compromised or burned up. Many of our drainage systems were plastic. They vaporized. Even our road culverts were vaporized, and we didn't even know it in some cases till you get down on your hands and knees and you realize the whole culvert's gone, But, the drainage systems, they're high and dry, and some of them are rerouting water with no, protected outlet. So walking pre-existing drainage systems, a lot of people didn't even know they had drainage systems. Quite a few of the homes in the foothills here above Montecito were in that situation. They may have moved in 10 years ago, but the house had been there for 40 or 50 years. Sometime in the past, there's drainage ditches on the hillside and underground drains, and a lot of these things were uncovered. Some of them were still functioning, but the problem is that they weren't complete systems anymore, and they would be taking any water now through these systems on an unprotected landscape. So evaluating those existing systems, possibly reinstalling new systems, possibly eliminating them entirely, and looking at more natural ways to let water flow over the landscape. Like I said, when you get into drainage treatments, you get into controlling water. And if you can do away with trying to control water and working with the natural lay of the land as much as possible, you'll have less to maintain, and you'll have a more complete long-term solution. Culverts and drains. After fire, almost every culvert and drain is undersized, because most of these culverts and drains were sized with vegetation on the landscape. And when vegetation's been compromised, burned off, destroyed, or removed, then the runoff increases. So in many cases, our culverts are going to be undersized even for a 1-year storm event, and maybe they were sized for a 25-year storm event. So replacement and larger size pipes may need to be needed. Overflow protection may be needed. Inlet control, where we have debris catchments, to make sure that not that the debris catchment would actually plug the culvert, but would allow the culvert to run free and clear, catching that debris, at another point, not right at the culvert inlet. And then the outlet control would be where the water came out of the culvert. In so many cases, like this particular picture here, you have a shotgun culvert going out over a burned landscape. Maybe in the past it hit a tree trunk or went into solid vegetation or something. Now it's just hitting a steep, bare slope. So there may be a need for some velocity dissipation at the outlet. And anytime you put a structure in that carries water, it's going to have a design capacity, and it's going to have a life expectancy, and it's going to have a huge maintenance responsibility. So K-rails and deflection measures. This was actually one that I recommended just before the Montecito debris flow. Fortunately, I'd only made a few site visits before that storm, but I was able to work with at least one landowner to give them a little higher level of protection from the potential for a debris flow. They didn't have the debris flow here. They had high water, but they still felt better about protecting their home with a measure like this. These can be made permanent if you're in a debris flow hazard area. There are temporary versions of K-rails as well that can be placed just during the wintertime. But it's important to say that safety first, and that no measure is going to give you a 100% guarantee that, that measure is going to protect, life and high value property. It's giving you maybe a higher level protection, provided it was installed properly and located properly. But there are little bit on stream bank erosion. Don't dump anything over the banks. I mentioned that earlier. Working with stream-sized neighbors is important because spot treatment almost always causes new problems. Maintaining bank vegetation and a buffer over the top of the bank. Sometimes people will clear everything right to the top of the bank, but there needs to be a buffer of vegetation before the water reaches the bank, because surface water contributes to surface water that's going over stream banks is contributing to stream bank erosion and loss as much as the water that's in the creek. Consulting with experts and to keep a watchful eye on everything from debris jams forming, trees falling, high water, muddy water. I have a really good stream publication as well. I think I do have it electronic too that I leave with anyone that lives along a stream, that gives you some good tips on stream care and living next to a waterway. Monitoring maintenance, as I mentioned more than once, is going to be important with any practice that's installed on landscape, whether it's short-term, long-term, or emergency. And it's might be needed after every storm event, not like in a regular year where you clear your gutters or your drains or whatever going into winter and you just do it as an annual event. Following fire, you may have to do it after every rain or even during a rainfall. I'm going to leave the fire safe landscape tips for Sabrina's presentation. This will be a duplication of effort. And I'll end with my top 10 list of what property owners should consider if fire has caused damage to their property. Number 10, get help from licensed experts, NRCS. Number 9, respect the laws of nature. When you control water, you control nature. Number 8, one size doesn't fit all. Every property is unique, has its own unique set of variables. Number 7, minimize soil, slope, and plant disturbances. No urgency to remove burned trees or plants. Number 6, look beyond property lines. Work with your neighbors whenever possible. Number 5, protect property access. All road drainage facilities undersized after fires. You really have to look at those seriously. Even you say, oh, the road culvert, it survived, great, we don't have to do anything with that. You might have to. You might even be in an area where you didn't have fire, but everything in your drainage area in your neighborhood is burned, and all the water is coming to that culvert. So it's going to be way undersized. Number 4, emergency measures have a high risk and can provide a false sense of security. Number 3, practices need maintenance. Number 2, doing nothing or less may be best. And number 1, there's no silver bullet. I wish there was, but there isn't. When it's not safe, it's not safe. And it's always good to have an emergency plan, including an emergency exit plan, and having more than one exit, and knowing your exit, and not just with a car. I mean, I've heard so many stories, meeting with so many people. Many people basically couldn't even get in their car. They were running out of their neighborhoods, and they didn't even know what was at the end of their street. So know how you can escape on foot, as well as what your alternative accesses are with a vehicle. We're going to do questions at the end, Jeff, I think. It ballpark. The question is, what does hydromulching run per acre? And again, it's depending on whether or not you have seed and tackifier in it, or whether it's just mulch, and fiber. But I've heard costs anywhere between $3,000 and $5,000 an acre. So it can be a pretty expensive venture. But a lot of times people only want to do a quarter of an acre, and it might be reasonable for them to do that if it's a quick down and dirty kind of thing, and then it limits their access on a slope. Yes. So, and you know that they included seed in the mulch? Okay. Right. And are you seeing grass come up in those areas? Oh, okay. Yeah, hydroseeding would be broadcasting seed in that. In some cases, the seed, may just stay there and be a source of growth next year, not this year, depending on what they seeded. A lot of seed is, like I said, it's a warm weather seeding, or it's native, then it's going to be slower to germinate. If it was a cereal grain and it came up quick, then that's probably what it was. Sometimes like a sterile wheat or barley is recommended. It's for quick cover, but again, it's one of those things. If it's a very site-specific call, to just shotgun broadcast it over a large area, it may not give you the benefit, and may cause more infiltration of water into the soil by its very nature. Grasses do. Any other questions? I'm going to introduce Sabrina Drill with UC Cooperative Extension. She's a natural resource advisor for Los Angeles and Ventura counties. She also shared the podium with me at Ventura College a few months ago. Some more information on it.
Thank you, Rich. What do you do with the remote? Thank you. Oh, and there's Rich's information. So maybe we can post that back up at the end. Does anybody, if folks are writing that down, I can wait for just a sec. Taking pictures of it. I am Sabrina Drill, the Natural Resources Advisor for Los Angeles and Ventura counties for UC Cooperative Extension down there. And my beat is usually helping organizations that are doing restoration of natural habitat. So I'll talk a little bit about that today and a little bit about fire-safe, I should say fire-resistant landscaping closer to homes. Several years ago, partly in response to the widespread fires in 2007, we started a project called Safe Landscapes. And what that stands for is Sustainable and Fire-Safe Landscapes. And what we're really trying to do with this is look at ways that we can improve near-home landscaping areas to both increase fire resistance and fire resilience, but also to protect the neighboring habitat areas that we find in the wildland-urban interface. So that's really the areas where houses back right up to natural habitat, and those areas are prone to a number of different kinds of risks and benefits, fire being one of those. So there's three things I'm going to touch on briefly today. One is talking a little bit about fire ecology in Southern California ecosystems, chaparral and coastal sage predominantly, but I'm just going to talk in generalities about that briefly. Then I'll talk a little bit about fire recovery in wildland areas, not so much the erosion control, the areas that are heavily managed, Rick focused on, but what's happening in more natural habitat areas. And then I'll talk about how to establish fire-resistant landscapes, which hopefully will be relevant for those of you who are replanting in areas or wanting to make improvements in your landscape. So a couple of things that we're finding about wildland fire. We've definitely been seeing changes in the fire regime throughout California. There's a couple of reasons for that. In Southern California, a lot of it has to do with human-caused ignition. In Northern California, a lot of it has to do with both human-caused ignition and a history of fire suppression. And in both places, are the return intervals of fire and really the drought seasons and how long our droughts are persisting are exacerbated by climate change and then have impacts for how fire behaves on the landscape and the size and severity of the fires that we're seeing and the timing as well. So one of the things that I just want to take a minute to point out here is that there's a lot of talk about fire suppression and the need to return fire to landscapes, especially forested landscapes. But one of the things that's really important to think about is the size of California, right? We live in a huge state. And so to make generalities about how we should manage fire that apply to the whole state is impossible. The Sierras are different from the North Coast, and both are very different from Southern California. In Southern California, we're not seeing evidence of fire suppression. We're seeing fires that are more frequent and larger in size than we think we've seen naturally in the past. And so it really has to do with an increase in both drought cycles and in human-caused ignition. Another thing that we think about in wildland fire management is fuels management, how we can do selective thinning to protect resources, and where we're seeing changes in vegetation and where we can maybe focus our restoration efforts to create landscapes that are appropriate for the climates we think we're going to be seeing now and in the future. We see brush clearance encroaching on wildlands as we have more and more development. This is something that's been discussed really a lot in the wine country fire areas because it was new developments, primarily that were put in areas that had burned historically that suffered the worst damage. So areas like Coffee Park. So where we have new development, and then we have people doing brush clearance or fuel modification around their homes, that encroaches even further than the development into areas that might be benefited by having a natural fire regime. We talk a lot about the use of prescribed burning in certain areas, and I think Matthew's going to touch on that a bit in rangelands in Santa Barbara and Ventura counties. And then what I want to focus on a little bit is to talk about invasive species in fire. So some of this is what I mentioned before. In coniferous, in areas of the state that are dominated by coniferous forest, there has been a history of fire suppression. That fire suppression has allowed a lot of growth and really a certain kind of maturation in those forests where there's, when you have those really large trees, you actually inhibit some of the saplings, you inhibit some of the understory growth. Those trees eventually senesce. Trees live a long time, but not forever. And then we have these very mature areas where we have these huge conflagrations breaking out. But again, none of that is really the story in Southern California, where we have chaparral and sage-dominated areas. Talked a lot. I made some of those points already. So talking about fire and invasive plants, there's a couple of reasons that I'm interested in invasive plants. Invasive species are a huge factor influencing native habitat, especially in areas where we have large human populations. But all around the globe, I actually work a lot on invasive tree pests as well. So you guys may have heard about the Kuroshio shothole borer, that there is an infestation that was found in Montecito. Apparently a lot of the trees that were infested with shothole borer were downed in the mud flow. So there's a bit less of a risk now from that. Invasive plants can increase fuel loads, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that and how that relates to how you should manage landscapes. Overclearance and bare earth for fire safety can lead to the spread of invasive plants, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then post-fire, these weeds can lead to type conversion and the loss of native biodiversity. Just some examples of this. We've got dense mats of really thick ground covers of invasive species like ice plant, ivy, and vinca. These can harbor hotspots, and what that means is it looks like you've got this great green, lush vegetation cover that would be resistant to fire, but underneath there's a lot of dead material. And so fire can actually run underneath these areas that are dominated by like mats of ivy, and it's really hard for firefighters to know where those are going to pop up later. So that's quite a challenge there. Annual grasses in desert areas. Desert areas, if you think about what a desert looks like, plants are spaced pretty far apart because of limited water. And you have some larger trees, larger cactuses and things, but you have bare earth in between them. When annual grasses come in, you actually create this continuous bed, and that's something that can carry fire across the landscape. So we've seen larger fires in desert areas than we would expect. Scotch and Spanish broom, I actually drove up into Los Padres on Sunday, and there's just Spanish broom everywhere. I mean, that's been spreading for the last several years, but we see it a lot up there, and it's spreading into new areas post-fire. For sure, these form these really dense stands that can bring fire up through hillsides faster. And then a rhododendron, giant cane, I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but it's the bamboo-looking plant that we see in a lot of our beds. That can bring fire down to stream beds, so where we'd have naturally occurring fuel breaks, now they become fire corridors. And it clogs waterways, absolutely, yes. Nasty, nasty stuff. So I did want to take a minute, again, to talk about what invasive species are. And I think this is important because there's a lot of confusion. When people talk about invasive species and the need to control them, other folks will think, well, you're talking about everything that isn't native. It's really a very small subset of non-native species that are actually invasive because by definition, they have to be known to cause harm. That's the legal definition of an invasive species. It can be harm to property, it can be harm to human health, it can be harm to the environment, and other kinds of infrastructure. So things like quagga mussels we've seen spreading throughout California, harming water infrastructure. A non-fire related example, really. They can be all kinds of different things: diseases, predators, competitors with native species, but they're things that are adapted to disturbance. So if we actively disturb plant communities, either through fire itself or through the act of clearing areas of vegetation because we think we're preventing fire, you leave those areas more prone to weedy invasion afterwards. And just, if you're interested in this kind of thing, there's been some worldwide analyses they've contributed to the decline of 42% threatened and endangered species and cost $120 billion in the U.S. annually. And that's from 2005. It's gone up since then, but that was the last time a really big economics assessment was done. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are things that are weedy. What does weedy mean? It means things that have a high reproductive rate and a short generation time. So they grow really fast. They get into an area, they spread fast, they grow fast. A lot of weeds grow up fast in the spring, and we're seeing this with mustard right now, for example, and they die back by the fall. So keep that in mind. There are things that are adapted to local climatic conditions too. So we have to be really careful when we think about wanting to install a water conserving landscape. That's great, but it's those plants that don't need a lot of water, but that come from Africa, the Mediterranean, Israel, South America, that can spread without extra water. So they're the ones that are likely to do well in our Southern California arid climate and spread really well. So you have to be really careful when you think about new species to bring in, say, for use in the horticulture industry. Okay, this is where the pointer is going to be. Not having the pointer will be a little bit of a drag, but essentially what type conversion is natural fire cycles can be beneficial. They clear out areas for new growth, and we have a lot of plants that are fire adapted, right? Fire is not a new thing. It's not an unexpected occurrence in Southern California. And a lot of our plants actually do really well when fires reoccur, say, every 20 to 50 years. On most landscapes, that's what they're adopting, maybe 30 to 60 in some of them, 30 up to 100. And we have plants that will only germinate after a fire. They have really long-lived seeds. The seeds are present in the seed bank, and they actually need the physical process of either exposure to smoke or heat in order to germinate. So there's a bunch of things that you could be on the lookout for this spring that are fire followers, that I'm starting to see a few things now that are really neat. But all of that said, these frequent high-intensity fires that we're getting because we have an increase in human-caused ignition and an increase in the length and the frequency of drought conditions lead us to kind of break that natural cycle that maintains native habitats. And so when that happens, invasive plants can come in, they create heavy fuel beds, they increase frequency and severity of fire, they reduce the native seed banks and harm resprouters, and then you get more invasive plants. So it's this really nasty reoccurring cycle that leads you to go from, say, a natural area of coastal sage scrub to an area that's dominated by annual invasive grasses. I don't know if people have gone out. I know in Ventura, a lot of people are going out to the Ojai Valley to take pictures in these beautiful fields of yellow. And for me, as an ecologist, I'm just kind of cringing that it's like just a monoculture of black mustard out in most of these areas. So when we think about fire recovery, natural recovery, so as I mentioned, many of our native woody species, especially oaks, will resprout from root crowns. They're adapted to fire. They do well in fire. And we have these annual and perennial shrubs that are fire followers. But in some cases, the best thing to do is do nothing. And Rich talked about this as well. Sometimes for erosion, the best thing to do is do nothing. For fire recovery, often the best thing to do is nothing. So replanting is usually not necessary. Seeding is not necessary from an ecological perspective. But controlling invasive weeds after a fire might be something that we do need to do if we want to maintain native vegetation in the long term. So these are just some pictures that I took in Arroyo Verde Park in the hills above Ventura. Well, months ago, we saw really quickly coming back and growing all over the hillsides Mara, the wild cucumber. It's usually a viney species. It is a viney species, and usually you'll see it climbing up trees, but without the trees, It was just spreading out over the landscape. And that's great. It provides cover, it grows fast, and it actually will protect to some degree from soil erosion and protect from that direct impingement of raindrops. It does increase infiltration, of course. So there's pluses and minuses to that depending on what you want out of a particular landscape. There's a oak over on the right that's resprouting from the crown. Looks pretty dead to most of us, but you can see that new green growth coming up at the bottom. And then giant wild rye is a large perennial grass that we're seeing all over the place. These are just some more, pretty wildflowers just starting to come up. This was early on, a native morning glory, lupins, blue dicks, and there's some kind of sage over to the left. Secret that I'll tell you guys, I'm actually a fish biologist who got interested in this stuff because of the impact of all of these issues on streams. So I'm not the best with my plant ID, but I'm learning. And these are some pictures that aren't from our local hillsides of just some pretty fire followers that we could see, especially in the Los Padres areas. I haven't heard reports of too many of these plants coming up yet, at least not the Douglasii. I've seen some orange monkey flower coming up in a lot of areas. I haven't seen the larkspur or the fire poppy yet on the Sputner zone, but I haven't been everywhere yet. But along with that, we're seeing the invasive species come up. So in a lot of areas, especially along paths and roadways, huge increase in the amount of castor bean. That's a particularly pernicious plant because it is toxic. It is a noxious weed. You can make ricin from the berries of it, and it's poisonous to wildlife who probably won't eat it, and dogs who might. Mustard, I mentioned before. There's a lot of thistles that I'm seeing in a lot of areas that are expanding rapidly. So now I want to shift, and I didn't even bring a watch up here, so how am I doing on time? What? 7:11. Okay. I can go a little bit faster here too. So fire-safe landscapes. Some of the points that I really want to make about this is that fire-safe landscapes, you need to start by thinking about the house itself. Oftentimes, I see people, their house is behind them, they walk out to the edge of their landscaping, and they look at the hillsides, and they're like, that's what I need to take care of. And behind them is a house that doesn't have sealed eaves, that doesn't have covers over all the ventilation, that has wood piles stacked up, and some nice Italian cypresses right next to the house. So it's really important to look back and think about, how can I harden the structure to resist wildfire? That said, I'm not going to focus a lot on that, but I will send you to another really great resource. So we used to have this fabulous extension advisor, Steve Quarles, who did a lot of work on structures and in fact did a lot of the research that went into the newer building codes. He retired and moved on to a better paying gig with the it doesn't even say it up here. It says IBHSS in the top corner. You can see it, but it's the Insurance Institute for Building and Home Safety is what all of those letters stand for. And he's put together some really great fact sheets there that take you through doing an on-site assessment of things you can improve on your home or things to think about if you're rebuilding. So when we go back to then this picture, and I do have this slide in here twice, what you can note is after you think about what can I do to improve the house itself, it's what can I do right next to the home? And realize that with the structure itself, there's things you can do to deal with the direct flame impingement, the consuming fire burning right up to your home. But what you usually want to focus on, because this is where far more homes are lost, is the ember storm. Most of our fires are wind-driven, and so it really has to do with all of these embers flying around and how they're going to get into your structure, especially into attics, how they can get into structures, and how they can get into landscaping and then start that consuming fire right next to your structure. That's what you're trying to battle, to make your house more fire resistant to fire. But the other thing that you're really focusing on after doing everything you can there is creating a defensible space zone around your home where firefighters are willing to take a stand. Because if they don't think that there's a chance of working at that particular home, they may move on to the next home where there is. So defensible space means thinking about the 100 feet around your home and ways that you can, sure, reduce fire ignition and direct fire spread, but it's really about dealing with those embers and providing an area where it's easy to attack whatever comes at that landscaping in terms of embers and quickly put it out before it gets to be a crown fire that is producing its own embers. So there's ground fire low along the ground and crown fire when it goes up to the tops of trees. A thing to think about throughout this, and it'll come up again, is reducing those fuel ladders where you're taking a ground fire that's coming up to your property and making it into an ember producing fire. If you can separate things, you have a chance there. Think about lean, clean, and green within 30 feet around the home, and in the next 70 feet, it's reducing those fuel ladders. Going a lot further out doesn't necessarily offer a lot more protection, okay? It's not about, very few homes are lost in that direct flame impingement. It's usually embers getting into the structure, and those embers can travel for miles. You guys know how fast winds were during the Thomas Fire. Think about that. Those embers are coming for miles and miles, so an extra 100 feet is not necessarily going to provide that much more protection or any more protection. So the zones are very close to your house, having a fire-resistant foundation plantings, and as I mentioned before, a fire-resistant structure, reducing the fuel loads in that transition zone, and then just keeping things sort of clean and neat and reducing those fuel ladders further out. The non-combustible zone, that's 0 to 5 feet right around the home. And in that, you want no flammable material, essentially. So I just worked with the folks who do the ocean-friendly gardening program. And they have a lot of information about, like, can you bring water off your roof and start using it in your garden immediately? And I sort of said, you can put in a dry stream bed and move it 5 feet away from your structure and then slow it, spread it, and sink it. But you really want not to have anything flammable right up against the house. And that can be plant material, it can be firewood, it can be scrap wood that you're planning to use for a project, it can be furniture, propane tanks. Think about moving anything flammable away from the home and realize that you might not be home when the fire comes and you might not be able to get to your house. So keeping things away, say if you go on vacation, I mean, if you have some furniture that you use near your house, that's great, but you might want to push it away if you go out of town. Keeping trees trimmed and having a few well-spaced shrubs. This is a good place for a vegetable garden, annual flowers, things that are not going to grow real big and are going to stay very green. Okay. Where to not to plant. I fixed that after I sent the slides to I figured I'd stick with it because I knew that you already had these slides. Under vents and eaves, adjacent to the siding, under or near decks, and really, it's rare that people are going to plant anything under decks, but think about what you're storing under decks. Think about if that's where you're storing woody materials, and if you can seal that off or come up with another place and maybe have a gravel mulch under a wooden deck or a Trex deck. And really think about corners, because that's where embers get trapped as they're flying in, right? So you don't want to provide an area where embers are going to accumulate and there's something for them to light on fire. And things will be drying out very quickly in a wildfire scenario, so think about that too. Separating vegetation from the house, again, good place for a walkway, gravel mulches, If you live in a high fire area, I probably wouldn't have a trellis on my house. And I wouldn't plant, again, things like Italian cypresses right under the eaves. I see that time and time again. In the second zone, you can have more vegetation, individual clumps of trees 10 feet apart, and pruning up your trees. So the idea, again, is vertical and horizontal separation of vegetation and keeping things really well maintained. Rich made that point too when it comes to erosion control measures. None of this is something that you're going to put in and go, and you're never going to have to deal with it again. All of this requires maintenance. Eliminating fuel ladders and ember production. I think I've talked about this quite a bit. Palms, Italian cypresses, pampas, and jubata grasses. These are things that are real ember producers. They're just the Roman candles of the fire world. Think about replacing pines and eucalyptus with less flammable, say an oak, sycamore, or a cherry. And Rich's list is really great and provides some great examples for that. Beyond that, you really want to think about reasonable fire hazard reduction, or what we call brush clearance. I have to be honest, I don't know the terminology that Santa Barbara County Fire or local city fire departments use now, but there's a problem with the term brush clearance. First off, it defines really beautiful native plants as brush and something not great. And clearance is probably not an appropriate goal, because if you clear, a lot of people come in May and June, so brush clearance deadlines are right around now. I'm not sure what the deadlines are in this area. And you just take out all that vegetation on your hillside. You're creating an erosion hazard where there wasn't one. And you're creating an area for annual grasses to get in, grow up through the spring, die in the summer, and just be fuel in the fall. So no donut holes, is that what that's supposed to be there? Where, so there's actually, there's a picture, the picture in the middle there, the second one down, inside all of those pines, there's a house. So they think they did a great job there doing their fuel hazard reduction, and they didn't think from house out at all. Okay. Plants. Any plant, except maybe that plant pictured right there, which is a metal sculpture, will burn under the right conditions. But there are fire-resistant plants, and fire-resistant plants are not the super lush landscaping that you might install, but you're never going to be able to water enough to maintain. It's actually things that do well, stay green, and keep a high moisture content even under dry conditions with limited watering. Because whatever you're watering you desire, you're likely to be facing watering restrictions for the future for a while now, right? I mean, talk about California getting out of the drought, but not Santa Barbara and not Ventura. Watch for those invasive plants from Mediterranean regions, and Mediterranean regions, all of those areas that I mentioned, Israel, South Africa, the Mediterranean itself, South America. You don't have to use all native species, but you can use all native species. I'm not saying that all native species are good for fire-resistant landscapes, but there's plenty of native species that are, so you have a fire-resistant landscape made up entirely of natives. And Rich, again, handed out a list, or there's a list in the back that he worked on that's really great. So highly flammable plants are things that have volatile substances, oil content. They produce a lot of dead material, and dead material that's hard to get at and is hidden. So think about like a juniper hedge. It might look beautiful and green. You reach inside and a ton of dead material in there. So it's actually things that you want to think about, things that don't require a lot of maintenance and don't require a lot of water. And palms are another one where, you know, you can keep them well trimmed. A lot of people don't. And in a fire situation, they catch, there's fire and there's wind, and they catch fire, and you have a flaming arrow that can break through your non-tempered 2-pane glass windows in an older home. So you've created a hazard where you don't need to. So I mentioned this before, but just to hammer it home, fire-resistant plants store water in their leaves and stems. They're slow growing with little maintenance required, and usually like an open growth form is great because you can then see and trim away any dead material in there. Low levels of oils and things that aren't going to be weedy and invasive. And it's great if they have extensive root systems and they're things that are going to survive fire, or even if the top layer is burned, they're still holding the soil layer back even after you've lost the above ground vegetation. So just some examples of fire-resistant native plants. We didn't coordinate this, so I don't know if all of these are on your list, but I'm hoping many of them are. Things like Dudleas. You have to be careful with Dudleas, though, because there's a big issue with Dudlea poaching. A lot of people going out and taking Dudleas from wild habitat areas and selling them. It's been a real problem. So these are good examples of native plants you can use, and there's some great resources out there. So Rich mentioned the California Native Plant Society and the really fabulous book that they put out, but also the lists that go with it. And I believe they're working on a Southern California version of the book. Rich, do you know? Okay, I will find out. But most of the stuff in that Northern California or California-wide version is appropriate for us down here. California Invasive Plant Council has a great list of invasive plant alternatives, and then the Plant Right website, which is actually a joint project between some environmental groups and the horticulture industry to look for new horticultural species that aren't going to pose any environmental problems. They have a good list too. Take-home messages. Maintenance is much more important than plant choice, and that's why I actually don't have a recommended fire planting list. It's great to use the one you get tonight, but just realize that just because you've bought and installed those plants doesn't mean you're done. You have to keep them alive. Dead plants are fuel. Water does not equal maintenance. Just throwing water at it, you can kill a lot of our native plants by overwatering them. If they get a fungus in the roots and die, they're no better off than they were if you didn't water them and they died because of a lack of water. Either way, they're dead and they're fuel. Right. Yep. So less frequent, deep watering. You may, if you have a well-established drought-resistant, fire-resistant landscape, you'll probably only need to water once every couple months, even through the summer. And during the winter, not at all. Slow-growing plants are easier to maintain and require less work. And you can accomplish multiple goals together. So the ocean-friendly gardens guidelines that are out now include so I went through those with the folks from Surfrider, and we took out a few things that might not be appropriate for fire-prone areas, and now they are both ocean-friendly and fire-resistant. And with that, just a picture, just a reminder of what poorly maintained looks like and what well maintained looks like. And just a couple of examples. You can go, this is more severe than everyone would like. It is a good example of a fire resistant landscape where things are really broken up and heavily managed, a lot of stone and rock mulch. But you can also have something that's lusher but still follows all of the sort of prescriptions that I talked about, keeping things low growing and really avoiding those fuel ladders. So they've used grass close to the home. There's actually, it's a little hard to see because it is so lush. They've created a dry stream bed, or maybe at times a wet stream bed, where that little bridge goes over, and then things are actually spaced really well apart up there, even though it looks very lush. And that's it.
Phil Walker. I spent 35 years in the water resources field as a treatment plant operator, wastewater. But I remember seeing the first photos post-Zaka fire, 2007. It was probably December or January 2008. And, you know, it was very extreme, but the both Gibraltar Reservoir and Huncal at that time were, the water was treatable with only, I think, a raise of the activated carbon introduction in the treatment process. Now I understand they've had extreme difficulties trying to treat the water in Gibraltar and Huncal. And I think part of it is the extreme burn temps created by what, I don't know if you're aware of the stratospheric intrusion concept, where actually the upper atmosphere, the upper stratosphere winds generate an extreme wind and an extremely rich in ozone, and it just vitrifies the soil. It turns the adobe soil into like a very vitrified clay that is extremely colloidal in the water and very difficult to treat. Thank you.
You're welcome. Wasn't really a question there, but just to add to that comment, I think one of the things that has been really interesting for me to see, just looking hiking upstream since the fire, is in some cases an increase in surface flow, in part because there's a lack of vegetation sucking up any of that rainfall. So we, of course, you guys know we had some very severe rains right after the fire, but also because of the actual ash in the stream beds itself, really closing up any porosity there that would allow more infiltration. And so we've had high surface flows, a lot of ash in that water. Of course, because there were structures that burned, there's different and more severe water quality issues than there would be if it was just a forest fire or a chaparral fire. But I think in addition to that, just because of the history of drought leading up to that, there were salts and things that had accumulated in those reservoirs over the past 5 or 6 years that just hadn't been diluted. So it's all kind of in there. But that's an interesting point to add to that.
And I grew up in the Bay Area, born up in San Mateo, and lived in Menlo Park. I surfed Santa Cruz. I know that area real well too. And just some smaller fires I remember growing up, maybe in the Santa Cruz Mountains, but I do not remember the fires that they're having today. So I think there's been a drastic change in the fire regime and the frequency and the burn temps. Thank you very much.
The fact that they haven't been doing controlled burns in the backcountry. Are they going to now, given the intensity of this fire, and they were just letting the fire burn in the backcountry?
So I would not expect there to be a lot of controlled burns in the backcountry now, because most of the backcountry burned. So at this point in time. But, as I mentioned before, we really don't have a decrease in fire frequency in Southern California the way they do in Northern California. So there's a lot of talk about returning fire to the land in coniferous forest areas of the state, and I think that's absolutely the right thing to do. But we're not seeing fire suppression cause a lack of fire in Southern California. We're seeing more frequent fire than historically was present on the landscape. So I personally don't think there's a need to return more fire to the landscape. Now, I think prescribed fire can be used as a way to provide some fuel breaks and protection around what we call assets at risk. So where there are things that we value beyond natural habitat, but I don't think there's a need to return fire to the landscape to preserve the environment in Southern California now. I do think there is in Northern California. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of conditions that need to be appropriate to use prescribed burns. I know they do it a little bit in Santa Barbara County and some in Ventura County. I also work in LA County where they pretty much never do it because we never have enough good air quality days where we can get permission to introduce it. And that's its own whole argument, though, about air quality, and are we sort of saying, well, we're going to accept poor air quality during a fire and not risk air quality if it's caused by people, but that's an argument for another day, another night.
Thank you for both very interesting presentations. I appreciate the expertise that you bring. I agree with this idea that the Ember attack seems to be very significant in the houses that I've looked at in this last fire. And the key issue would seem to be architectural standards in that regard. It's hard for me to process the claim that there's not a need for more fire in Southern California. I see a tremendous amount of money being spent to stop the fire and its progress. And then, we had fires years ago in Ventura, and then we got this big Thomas fire that came a little bit later. I believe that if we're spending this much effort controlling the fire, there has to be some degree to which fuel is accumulating and the fires become bigger as a result. I also wonder about this idea of, in the prior presentation, about using K-rail. It's similar to this issue of levees. So when you raise the levee on one side of the river, you're basically sending it to another property. So I'm just wondering about the potential for properties to affect one another in this way, both in terms of allowing fuel load to increase and also in terms of doing things like K-rail, which is over a foot high, to potentially direct the mud flow or the water flow.
K-rails definitely is a site-specific call, and I agree with you, because setting up a K-rail is like setting up a diversion. You could just be diverting water to cause damage to other properties. Similarly, when you do stream bank protection, you could be protecting your bank, but you could just be speeding the water, deflecting the water to your neighbors. So it's something that you do with a site-specific design. The one that I showed on the screen was one that was designed by my engineer that works out of our Santa Maria office. All of the water was on a big, large ranch. They own both sides of the waterway. So they were diverting water away from high-valued structures onto less valuable land. But you bring up an excellent point. It's true with almost any practice. We have to look at the collateral potential damage of protecting one thing only to make a mess someplace else or cause a problem for someone else. There's also liability associated with that, and I have to explain that to property owners all the time, because you have to reduce liability for what you may cause on someone else's property by a practice that you might install. K-rail or any kind of a ditch, a sandbag, dike, you're moving water, and you say, yeah, well, I have to protect my property. But if you cause property damage to someone else, that's something to talk to an attorney about. I'm not trying to give you legal advice. You have to be very careful. I've been an expert witness on way too many situations like this that is getting back to working with neighbors is a way of forestalling or preventing these kinds of things from happening. So you have a neighborhood plan if you're going to do something with K-rails or stream bank protection or anything else where there's a movement of water to protect a high-value structure or life. Because sometimes there's no other way to do something quickly, particularly when you have fire, and storm in the same sentence in the same week. You don't have time for months of planning and design work. You have to do something quickly to safeguard, property.
I just wanted to let everyone know, Sabrina is a visiting speaker here, and so unfortunately, we don't have anyone from county fire, city fire, Montecito fire to really address the controlled or prescribed burn question. So, you know, she's not probably answering that because it's really not for her to. So I apologize that we don't have anyone here tonight to talk about that. But it's a question that comes up a lot, and we've actually had some scheduled, and then we have high winds, so they have to cancel. And there's you know, I'm not the expert on that either, but I just wanted everyone to know that Sabrina would probably be out of place if she tried to answer that. So I'm letting her off the hook on that one.
I'm on Mountain Drive, off Mountain Drive, and across Hot Springs Creek. And I was involved, my house was involved with the mud flow, etc., my debris and all that. How long do you think the mountains will recover with establishment of chaparral and all that? When I look at the mountains, it's really scary. And for Rich, what do you know about vetiver grass? I've never heard of it, but my neighbor up on top, whose belongings came to my lot, is thinking of planting it. Thank you.
For the, it kind of depends on how you define recovery. I think in the next 5 years or so, hopefully we'll have a level of vegetation recovery where we're not seeing the extreme land movement that we've seen this past year. But I would say for the vegetation to be considered sort of mature chaparral vegetation, we're talking 10, 12, 15 years. On from there.
If I could go back to the discussion about diversionary tactics, there has recently been an adaptation of a like-for-like rebuilding ordinance, and which means that the whole process is going to be administrative with no kind of review, no kind of oversight. And I know there's concurrently been discussion about people who want to reposition their homes so it might provide a better diversion of water, or building walls or building other things to divert the water. Are you in a position, or is anyone in a position to advise county or advise builders, or is there any kind of precautionary measures in place so that these kinds of things can be prevented? Or is it just a matter of, after the fact, somebody suing somebody else because mud was diverted onto their property?
Yeah, no, I see this as actually a tremendous opportunity to change things the way that they were, to make them better, especially if fire has completely destroyed, the system that's in place that might not have been the best system that was designed, 30, 40, 50 or more years ago. If you have to start from scratch, then use the current, thought process and design standards for, working with nature and planning systems that have less, maintenance responsibilities. Planning the house, just even moving the house 8 feet one direction or the other might take it out of harm's way, but they didn't know that 45 years ago or 50 years ago, whatever. Yeah, because that's, when I'm going out and visiting properties that, and seeing what was there before, they had just done this or they just had done that, but, that information wasn't available in previous building codes and what have you. But it's just to rebuild back exactly what was there with no opportunity for improvement seems like a missed opportunity. I mean, I tend to agree with you. I don't have any, pull here in Santa Barbara County, but I would hope that that possibility exists, but it sounds like it does if they're just allowing people to rebuild what they had there before without any improvement.
the whole point is that previously there was a like-for-like ordinance that had to do with fire replacement, which meant that there was a basic foundation to work with. In the recent debris flow with houses that have been completely destroyed, foundations that have been destroyed, there is now a decision to allow people to rebuild wherever they want to on their property as long as it doesn't exceed certain parameters. But some of that wherever they want to may very well be positioning it in a way that benefits the property owner but has a detrimental effect to their neighbors. And I'm just wondering if that is something that anybody or that you can have any input on, or that there's any kind of advice that you could lend, or it's just a concern of mine.
Design review, that those consideration, there wouldn't be any. You just move the house, you get an architect, and you move the house to another part of the property, and you don't have to consider, you know, neighbor. Yeah, yeah. It's a wrong question for me, but.
Yeah, we have one more. I'd like to have the opportunity.
Great. Yeah, no, I was just going to introduce our new rangeland and livestock advisor for Ventura and Santa Barbara County with UC Cooperative Extension, Matthew Shapiro. And he had the pleasure of starting with us. You were on the job about a month before the Thomas. Oh, 3 months before the Thomas started. That's a whole quarter. You were ready. Okay. Anyway, I'll hand it over to Matthew.
Thank you, Sabrina. Thank you for having me this evening. It's a real pleasure to follow after Rich and Sabrina. A real honor. My presentation is going to be pretty different than what has come before. They've focused really sort of on the home, on the small-scale property owner, and my presentation takes a sort of a broader view of Thomas Fire and also recovery efforts post-Thomas Fire. Let me just juggle this here for a second. So my title is as Livestock and Range Advisor, and I say that and I often get these sort of confused and blank looks. The livestock part people get, and I explain, well, range, you know, sort of home on the range, where the deer and the buffalo, etc. And the blank looks ease a little bit. But I thought I would start my presentation this evening with a really quick sort of definition of terms so that we're all on the same page. So rangelands. Rangelands are largely what burned in the Thomas Fire. And rangelands in this map are pretty much everything that isn't mint green. So it encompasses a huge amount of the Earth's surface. It's land on which the vegetation is predominantly grasses, grass-like plants, forbs, or shrubs, and is managed as a natural ecosystem. Examples include grasslands, savannas, shrublands, deserts, tundras, alpine communities, marshes, and meadows. So some examples: annual dominated grasslands in the Central Valley here, perennial dominated grasslands or prairie in South Dakota. Here's an East African acacia savanna. Tundra is also included as rangelands. Oak woodland, just a couple hundred miles north in Santa Clara County. And just a couple hundred miles southeast of us in the Mojave Desert, also considered rangeland. And this is a scene that probably looks more familiar to us here in Ventura and Santa Barbara County. This is a California oak savanna. And this should also look familiar. This is Chaparral and Happy Valley of Santa Barbara County. So I know these numbers are small on these screens, but this is rangeland types by acres in Ventura and Santa Barbara County. And what you see here is that Ventura is about 1.2 million acres in total size. Santa Barbara is about 1.6 million acres in total size. And rangeland encompasses most of the county. In fact, in Ventura, it's above 80%, and in Santa Barbara County, it's above 90%. And you can see a breakdown of the different types of rangeland in our county, largely made up of some of the grassland areas, or what would be considered grassland areas. So annual grassland, blue oak woodlands, coast oak woodlands are a little bit more heavily wooded rangeland areas. And then you can see in the middle of the descriptions there that chaparral takes up a huge amount of acreage. And so that's Chemise, redshank chaparral, and mixed chaparral. And then there's the California coastal sage scrub, which is sometimes considered a soft chaparral, but is different than the harder, true chaparral. And so those are rangelands. So what is range? Well, range is a category of rangelands. Range is almost a land use. So it's land supporting vegetation that is either grazed or has the potential to be grazed. So in the two counties, in Ventura and Santa Barbara, you see there again the total rangeland figure, and then a category which is grazing lands, which roughly represents what range is. So in Ventura, it's just under 200,000 acres, and in Santa Barbara, it's just under 600,000 acres. In Santa Barbara County, it's a little bit over a third of the total county, and in Ventura, just under 17%. And so my point in introducing with these slides is to suggest that rangeland covers most of these counties. Most of these fires that happen in these two counties burn rangelands, but there's an interesting and important interplay of range or grazing lands in and amongst these fires. So I want to turn to some maps. I think it's going to help us visualize what I'm talking about, then also transition my talk into fire a little bit better. So here's Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. That mint green color represents the Forest Service. See, this is Los Padres National Forest. Of course, it extends into Kern County to the east and north into San Luis and Monterey counties and beyond. That yellow that just came on the screen is all of the grazing lands that exist in our counties. So that would be range. And this next slide took me aback when I prepared it. This is a layer from CAL FIRE. These are all the fires that have burned since CAL FIRE has been keeping records, and that's since 1898. 983 fires, and of those 983 fires, approximately 360 have been over 500 acres in size. And of course, there's the Thomas Fire from this last December. And so stepping back and looking more specifically at the Thomas Fire, it's clear, or you can see, that over 50% of the Thomas Fire that burned was in Forest Service land. But you can also see down there in the sort of southeastern portion of what burned, a lot of it burned grazing lands. And in fact, that's where the fire started. And as a result, because of my position and because of my research interests, I've been really focusing on what's happened with the Thomas Fire, but specifically where the Thomas Fire burned with grazing lands and where there were ranches. I'm going to zoom in on that a little bit. And I wish I had a pointer to be able to show you, but essentially I hope you can visualize sort of down near the bottom we have the city of Ventura, that strip that runs up northeast that didn't burn, that's the Santa Clara River Valley, where the 126 runs. The Ojai Valley is that unburned shape in the middle of the Thomas Fire there. So it really gives you a sense to see how much grazing land burned in the Thomas Fire. And the fire started, again, I wish I could point to it, but sort of on the eastern flank where Route 150 is. It burned west the first few days, and then, of course, came back around, burned east some, and then up into the north. So this is what a ranch looked like in Ventura County after it did burn. The burn was extremely patchy. The severity and the intensity of the burn varied quite a bit. Varied quite a bit. And so you had some areas that were burned quite severely, and other areas where vegetation was left completely untouched, or where biomass was left incompletely burned. And the burn intensity and the severity of the burn depended on these things, on ambient temperature, on relative humidity, on the wind direction. We've discussed the sort of unprecedented Santa Ana winds that came the first couple of weeks of the fire. Rich talked quite a bit about slope and aspect as they pertain to both recovery, but also to how the fire burned. Soil texture, and then fire is also deeply impacted by the fuel type, the moisture of that fuel, and by the grazing history. And for the course of my presentation, I'm going to focus on those last two things, fuel type and grazing history. This is an image that I didn't take, but an image I hope familiar to most. This is sort of typical Santa Barbara County, right? And the point that I'm trying to make with this image is that our landscape is incredibly varied, incredibly heterogeneous. So you see in the foreground grasslands, there's a riparian corridor. Up on the slopes there, we have some coastal sage scrub. In the far back, some hard chaparral. And what that means, well, here's another image. Oops, excuse me. Another image. Again, extremely varied. Grasslands in the foreground, coastal sage scrub in the middle ground, and that true chaparral on the mountain slopes. And what that means is that those different vegetation types drive the behavior of the fire and the intensity of the fire and the severity of the fire. So you get landscapes that look like this post-fire, where you have heavier burns in the foreground with some patchiness in the middle ground. And then up there at the top, you can see that white ash flare. You can almost see individual plants as they burned with that elevated severity. Here's another image. This is a ranch from the Ojai area. In the foreground, you can see a fuel break that was actually created by the Forest Service there. In the foreground, that's grassland that had been grazed. But I especially like this image. You really get a sense of the full landscape, of the patchiness to it, of the way that the aspects, so the way that the slope is facing, which cardinal direction, the way that that has impacted how it's burned. And again, those white areas where you can see individual plants that burned especially hot and severe. And all of this is going to be impacting the degree and the speed with which rangeland is able to recover post-fire. Here's an image from a north-facing slope. So this slope had especially shrubby cover, largely due to its aspect. And you can see just how, it's a crummy photograph, I know, but you can just see how completely denuded the landscape is post-fire. So generally speaking, the impacts from wildfire immediately are twofold. You have physical changes to the soil and the removal of vegetation, which of course can lead to excess runoff and erosion. Rich talked quite a bit about that, and here in Montecito, you know all too much about it. And the fire can also lead to elevated temperature from fire and from smoke, impacting the actual soil seed bank. And in some instances, that actually triggers some fire-adapted species to germinate, but in many instances, it actually destroys the seed so that it's unable to germinate. The morning after the first evening of the fire, I already started to receive calls from ranchers, and largely those calls fell into two categories of question. The first was, to what extent did the fire impact the soil seed bank? Should I reseed to encourage forage regrowth? And the second category of questions were, can I continue to graze my cattle on pastures that burned, and will grazing post-fire impact or retard rangeland recovery? And because of those two kinds of questions, I started two research projects trying to answer those two categories of questions. And I'm not going to talk about the second so much, in part because the research is ongoing and is going to take a few years for the results to come back. But I do want to briefly describe the project that I did looking at the soil seed bank, which I think has some relevant applicability more broadly in the. And that project involved going out to a selection of ranches. So in my case, I went out to 5 different ranches. And at each ranch, I went to 12 sites, 6 which were grassland sites and 6 which were shrubland sites. And I took soil core samples. And at each site, I took a sample which was not burned, a sample which was burned with low severity, and a sample which was burned with high severity. So if I can do the math right, that's, over 100 samples in total across the 5 ranches. Here's an example of what that looks like. So on the left, you can see a grassland area that burned, and I call it's a low severity burn where you can still see, there is combustion, but the above ground biomass is largely still there. And on the right is a shrubland area which had a high severity burn, mostly ash. Above ground vegetation is almost all gone. Here's what data collection looked like. This is a ranch just above the city of Ventura. And here are the soil samples out in the greenhouse. So the idea was to collect these soil samples, to take them back to a greenhouse, and then to artificially water them, and to see what germinated and how quickly. So here you can see the broad spectrum of both, of course, soil types, but then you can also see some of the darker coloration, indicating the severity of burn on the left. You can even see an oak leaf there, so likely a site which was unburned. On the right, a much more severely burned soil sample. Again, another shot, the variety of soils and burn severities. And so that was January 8th, I believe. Yeah, January 8th when I potted everything up and put it in the greenhouse. And so just a couple weeks later, this is what the artificial watered soil samples look like. And you can see there's a tremendous variety, or variation rather, between the different burn severities. And what I did was I counted the number of germinated seeds that came out of each pot. And the results I'm still organizing, but the long and the short of it is that there's a huge difference between grassland and shrubland sites. So sites that had shrubs had very little seedling germination, and granted I am looking mostly for grass seedlings and for forb seedlings, so sort of herbaceous dicot seedlings. There was much less evidence of some of the shrub species germinating in the soil samples. So those shrub sites had much less germination, largely because all of those shrub sites were had a high severity burn. There were almost no shrub sites that had low severity burn or that didn't burn at all. I had a lot of trouble finding those sites that didn't burn on shrub. On the grassland end, there was a real clear threshold between germination on low severity burns and high severity burns, suggesting that, so to be more specific, on low severity burns there was good germination, and on high severity burns there was poor germination, suggesting that there might be a threshold where you would, from a ranching perspective and from a forage perspective, where you might consider reseeding on your ranches to encourage forage for livestock, but it would have attendant benefits of protection from sediment loss and erosion. And I wanted to further clarify that distinction between low severity grassland burns and high severity grassland burns was really related to grazing history. And so pastures that had been grazed previous to the Thomas Fire burned less severely for the obvious reason that there was simply less biomass there to burn. Pastures that ranchers were saving to graze later in the year had higher, tall, dead standing material, which was still useful to their livestock, burned at a much higher severity, and burned at a severity at which it actually did compromise the soil seed bank. So the question is to seed or not to seed, and we've had a few folks already talk and offer their thoughts. And I agree with what's been said, and the only addition I'll make to the conversation is that as the livestock and range advisor and addressing the concerns or the concerns of the agricultural community, there's another piece to this, right, where when you're running livestock, you have forage to think about as well as ecological phenomena and sort of erosion and sediment control. And so the ranchers were faced with this question was, if the fire did compromise seed bank, according to that sort of high severity burn, is it appropriate to seed or not? The Forest Service for many, many decades, and many agencies in addition to the Forest Service, regularly seeded post-fire. They usually used Italian ryegrass. In the 30s and 40s, they even seeded black mustard in Southern California because it was recognized as a quick-growing plant that could get lots of biomass out on the landscape post-fire. Now, of course, recognized as a pernicious weed. And the Forest Service has stopped seeding, largely because of the research and recommendations from their own researchers and the NRCS. You know, it introduces non-native seeds. It's not always effective. It really depends upon the timing and amount of subsequent precipitation. So you can spend all sorts of effort getting seed out on the landscape, but if the rains don't come at the right time, or if they come too hard all at once, as was the case this last January, largely that seeding effort is ineffective. And ranchers need to balance these things, right? And so what they're concerned about sedimentation and runoff. They're also concerned again about forage regrowth. And so they need to balance, the cost and effort to put the seed out on the ground with what they would reap economically from the grazing activity in subsequent years. And the research is really unclear, even in the ranching context, whether it makes sense or if it pencils out to put seed out on the landscape for them. It's been shown that rangelands within 3 to 5 years recover back to their normal species composition and production. And so in that window, if you spend that money to seed, you really get it back. And so I was encouraging ranchers not to seed, in large part for the reasons that Rich and Sabrina mentioned. These landscapes recover on their own. We could be doing damage by artificially prodding them in certain ways. And so let's wait and see, right? There were a few individuals in Ventura who chose to seed anyways. And so this is an image from an aerial seeding in Ventura County. This was a 1,000-acre application of cereal rye seed. And I have to admit, I had my skepticism in part. We didn't know what the precipitation year was going to be like. This application, you can see it's already beginning to green up. This was in late January, so it was after that January 9th rain. But for example, if it had been seeded before that rain, so much of the seed would have been run off and lost down the creeks anyways. But to my great surprise, I have to admit that these are the images, and I'm sorry they're sort of poor quality. They were sent to me by phone by the rancher. But this is the stand of ryegrass a couple months later. And so for the rancher's purposes, I think they're quite pleased with what the effect has been. It's added biomass. It protected the soil from subsequent precipitation and presumably from next fall's early precipitation, however those storms come. And it's added a pretty substantial amount of biomass and forage for their livestock to graze. I want to talk briefly about specifically the impacts that the Thomas Fire had on the ranching industry in both, really Ventura County. You'll see on the later, maybe you already saw, but I'll show those maps again. There were no substantially large production ranches that burned in Santa Barbara County in the Thomas Fire, or at least none that I'm aware of. So the impacts from the Thomas Fire were most immediately lost livestock. And the number that we have on that is inaccurate. It's hard to get a full count. Some ranchers are in fact not even sure how many cattle they've lost because some are just missing. Carcasses were never found, and there is a thought that they might return. They're just on neighboring ranches. Another impact was lost dry forage from the previous spring's growth. I could talk at length about this, but in effect, those pastures that those ranchers were holding for feed later in the year that burned so severely, those pastures were really critical feed resources for those cattle moving through the wintertime. So to lose those pastures, to have those pastures burn up, Thomas Fire was a substantial economic hit for them. Lost future forage. I mentioned that it takes about 3 to 5 years for these rangelands to return to normal species composition and production. And that's because the year following fire, it's expected that forage production is about 50% of normal. Second growing season after the fire, forage production is about 80% of normal, and it's not until that third year that you begin to be seeing normal production. Of course, infrastructure damage across the ranch, fencing, water troughs, etc. Disrupted cash flow, and this is a complicated one, and it hits them in a couple of different ways. Some instances, they had to sell cattle immediately because they didn't have the forage to support them. In others, they were unable to wean the calves and sell the calves in the spring at the normal time that they would, or wean them nearly as heavy as they might be, or keep them as long as they normally would. And lastly, genetic loss in cattle, and this is kind of an amorphous concept, but basically, on a ranch, the genetic stock that you have in your herd is incredibly valuable. Those cattle are adapted to the landscape. They're adapted to produce well and produce a calf every year, and for that calf to grow well. And so to have to sell cattle after fire, even if it means that in a few years you're able to buy cattle back and get returned back to normal numbers, you've lost that work in developing your genetic stock. So those are just a few of the impacts that ranchers experience with the Thomas Fire. So I want to talk a little bit, there were questions earlier about prescribed fire, and I do address this a little bit in the coming slides. So I want to return to this map again. And here, what I want to focus on is the fact that, just visually speaking, you can see that, so again, in red, you see historic fires that CAL FIRE has recorded since the 1890s. And in yellow are grazing lands. And the thing that strikes me most immediately is that most of the grazing lands in Santa Barbara County in particular have not burned in wildfires in recorded. Now, of course, the case is a little bit different in Ventura County, where you can see down at the bottom that essentially all grazing lands have burned in the last 100 years. That, I believe, is a relic of the difference between the sort of climatological phenomena. So Santa Ana wind phenomenon is much stronger in Ventura County and drives a lot of the fires there. I'm going to talk about burn severity in a minute, but I think that despite those grazing lands having burned, I think they burned much less severely when they did burn. But again, returning to Santa Barbara County, it's striking that wildfires have not burned most of the county's grazing land. And I offer this photograph. This is from Ventura County, and this is what a lot of the ranches look like that I did my subsequent research on. And what I want to note is that in the foreground are grasslands that have been grazed and are completely unburned. And in the background are shrublands, chaparral, coastal sage scrub, which burned at moderate and severe burn severity. And in fact, when I went to do my soil project, there were many instances where I could not find grasslands on the ranch that had burned, and could only find unburned grasslands, even though the Thomas Fire had swept through. So what I mean to suggest is that grazing is an incredibly effective tool to manage fuels in both counties, and not only prevent fire, but then also keep fires less severe when they do happen. This is a map that is derived from satellite imagery, and it's a burn severity map. And this is the burn severity map of the Thomas Fire. And what you can see in white are areas that are the most severely burned, and areas black are areas that are unburned or much burned much less severely. And the Forest Service sends a team out after every burn, and they turn this remote sensed image and they ground truth it, and they turn it into a product that they call BART. I'm going to forget the acronym, but I think it's coming up later. Burned area, well, I'll get to it. But you can see that areas in yellow, again, are highly high severity burns, and areas in blue are lower severity burns, and areas in green are within the fire perimeter but are unburned. And here in black, it's a little bit hard to see, but it's just another image of where grazing lands are in the Thomas Fire perimeter. You can see that grazing lands, on the whole, burned much less severe than other areas of the fire, and you can quantify that. So here's the total fire perimeter. Areas that did not burn within the total fire perimeter are about 11%. High severity burn, and this is according to the Forest Service, and it is a qualitative judgment. And I had some questions about why they designated so little land as high severity burns, and that I have pending a conversation with the gentleman who conducted the burn severity assessment after the Thomas Fire. But you can see Moderate severity was about 56% of the burn, and low severity was 31% of the burn. And if you look at areas that were grazed or grazing lands, and I should specify grazing lands, at least in this sort of spatial delineation, are not necessarily lands that were grazed. They're just lands that have the potential to be grazed. Those numbers flip, or change. The no burn stays roughly the same, high severity stays roughly the same, but low severity is 52%, and moderate severity is 36%. So I also want to talk about prescribed burns, and the question has already come up. That same map that you recognize, there you see in mint green the Forest Service lands, and pale yellow the grazed lands in Ventura and Santa Barbara County. And in that pink color are the prescribed burns that have been conducted in those two counties since 1978. And you can see that it's, when compared to the wildfire that's burned in these two counties, it's a fairly small percentage. Since 1978, there have been 123 burns in total, burning about 57,000 acres across the two counties. And that's two counties that equal close to 3 million acres total size. And in the last 10 years, we've had only 14 prescribed burns in the two counties, totaling about 8,000 acres. And so I think it's been commented earlier, there is, I think, a renewed discussion around what prescribed fire might look like in these two counties as a fuels management treatment and as a way to manage our landscapes going to the future to make them more fire resilient, if you will. I think that there's, the largest burns you can see here in this image are conducted on Forest Service land, and there hasn't been a lot of burns on private land in either county in the last generation. There is work happening at the county level, some of which I'm involved in. There are really two pathways for prescribed burns to happen. Through CAL FIRE or an affiliated organization, and here it's the Santa Barbara County Fire, and in Ventura it's Ventura County Fire. They can conduct prescribed burns, and it's called Vegetation Management Program burns. The only problem is that a lot of the permitting to get those burns going can be onerous. So it can sometimes take years for one of those county fire agencies to get a burn through the pipeline. The second avenue for burns, for prescribed burns in the county, are private burns on private lands led by private landowners. And we're exploring it's not a new permitting effort, but it's recently been reemerged as a potential avenue, and that's called the LE7 permit. And we can access that through county fire, and county fire helps both some with the planning of the fire, some with the smoke management plan. But really, you are responsible for conducting your own burn on your own private land. There are a number of roadblocks to why there haven't been prescribed fires in the last generation. Some of that has to do with regulation. Certainly, air quality has been a concern, I think ought to be a concern. Sabrina suggested earlier, there is now this discussion of what the trade-off is, right? Do we put up with a few weeks of intensely hazardous smoke filling most of the county after the Thomas Fire, or are we okay with maybe some infrequent smoke in the air that's much less severe, that if planned correctly, goes into areas that aren't highly populated, which would be what it would be like to prescribe burn. There's also ecological concerns. The science is really out. There's discussion and controversy regarding how frequently these ecosystems should be burning, how regularly, and certainly there are some of the prescribed fire folks would like to burn more regularly than may be healthy for the chaparral or coastal sage scrub habitat. And also, because we haven't been conducting birds for a generation, a lot of that institutional knowledge has been lost. County fire regularly deals with fire, of course, but a lot of the folks, the private individuals and the ranchers who used to regularly burn privately in previous generations are less familiar with doing it. I think that we need to instill a culture of reinstilling that understanding and that knowledge of how to burn on a regular. So I mentioned the VMP burns, which are through CAL FIRE, and we're also working in Santa Barbara County on Santa Barbara County Range Improvement Association, which is an association largely made up of ranchers where they will be doing prescribed burns on private land. So I'm going to quickly finish up, share some good news, mostly some images for you. Without seeding, without hydromulching, without any of these sort of artificial recovery efforts, these rangeland landscapes are recovering on their own. So here we see an image just 8 days after the first rain, vegetation starting to come out of some pretty severely burned shrubland habitat. This is 3 months after the fire. This is a ranch that I drive by on my way home every evening. Here we are on another ranch above Ventura County. Very pleasing display of lupin coming up between the shrubland areas. Another image, and here I wanted to emphasize how different ecotones are recovering differently. So up in the upper right-hand corner, you see area that had been shrubs and burned more severely, recovering in a different way than the area in the foreground, which is just grass. Here's another image of that. See in the foreground that black mustard Sabrina was mentioning, unfortunately growing up, recovering. See many other species, lupin, of course, purple flowers there in the middle, and then those grassland ecotones up top as well. This is on an allotment on the Forest Service that is actually grazed just outside of Ojai. See the toyon shrub there, resprouting from the ground. That's the same ranch. Another image. So we're starting to get good cover on at least many of the ranches that I'm visiting. I do want to emphasize, though, that it's not all good news. That's hard to see, and I wish I could point it out, but that sort of pale green color in the midground there is a lot of yellow star thistle. So I wanted to emphasize something that Sabrina brought up, which is unfortunately this fire has opened up bare ground, and a lot of invasive plants that were present maybe at lower levels are using this as an opportunity to expand their range. Yellow star thistle. And then, of course, this is another it isn't all good news image. A lot of the sites that I visited don't necessarily have good vegetative cover. And this is, these photographs are intended to be peak standing crop because so many of these that are coming up, the thistles and the grasses, are annual species. This is sort of as much growth as we're going to be seeing from them until next fall when the rains come. So this is about as much cover as we can expect in this particular plot here. So we do see still quite a bit of bare. Another image showing that some of these more heavily burned areas are not recovering or don't have all that much biomass on them. That green strip through the middle, I think, is interesting. That's actually a cattle path. So that is where the cattle used to walk through the shrubs there, and it burned much less severely, if at all, and you can see how the grass is able to recover as a result. So I want to offer, thinking about the future, and encourage us as a community and our counties, think about grazing and prescribed fire, how they can and should be used as land management tools to promote wildlife habitat, biodiversity, the local livestock industry, and a responsible fuels management strategy. So with that, I'll end just with another example. I didn't have access to a good compare and contrast image like this, but I did from the East Bay. So these are the Berkeley Hills in 1900, over a century ago. These are those same Berkeley Hills about 90 years after that first image was taken. And this is that firestorm that Richmond goes by a few different names. Technically, CAL FIRE refers to tunnel fire, but this is that fire from 1991. My point here is that this is not new. Fire on the wildland-urban interface is something that California has been for decades, especially as we continue to build homes deeper into that wildland area. So we need to think responsibly and more effectively about what a strategy is going to look like at that wildland-urban interface. And I would urge us to think about grazing and prescribed fire as some of the tools that we can use in the toolbox. With that, I'll conclude and open questions, and I'm sure all three of us would be happy to answer questions.
First, I want to say thank you guys so much, all three speakers. Yeah, knowledgeable about everything here. This is a question for potentially all three speakers. We've all talked about this. It has to do with potentially reseeding, but mostly about invasive species after the wildflowers. Kind of three questions. They all kind of connect a little bit. Are there any preventative measures you guys would recommend that can be taken to decrease the invasive plant growth after a fire? Is one question. Second question is, can reseeding with site-specific native species help against invasive plant growth? Does it kind of help like add troops to the fight? I don't know, idea. And then third question is, what are some recommended methods of removing invasive species with minimal soil disturbance after the invasive have come through and are negatively affecting positive plant growth, like native species? How can we remove them without messing up the soil and messing with like
I imagine that between the three of us, you'd get a couple of different kinds of responses, in part just because of the scales that we work at. I mean, a lot of the homes here in Montecito are on quarter acre or less. The sort of landscapes that I deal on are 1,000 acres or more. To answer your first question about invasive plants and how to remove them, or okay. Sure. Yeah, so I mean, the difficulty is that when you're working with 1,000 acres, a lot of your tools are limited, in part just because it's expensive and the labor involved is prohibitive. You know, the invasive, for example, the yellow star thistle that I'm seeing on that Forest Service allotment, there aren't, you know, short of going out there and pulling them or weed whacking them, can't really take a mower over them. The terrain is far too severe, and you know, the rancher who grazes that particular allotment is not prepared to go out and weed whack or hand pull. And so one of the tools that wasn't discussed was herbicide applications. In that particular case, the Forest Service does not allow herbicide applications, so it's a case of being sort of limited in some respects in terms of invasive plant control. Fire has been effective at controlling some invasive plants, but it's a balancing act, because that to effectively reduce yellow star thistle cover with fire, you need to burn repetitively over the course of a couple of years, which is of course not what you want to be doing in these systems that need to cover post-fire. So I don't have a real good answer for that one, only than to say that it's complicated. I don't know if the other speakers on a smaller scale want to address that.
Well, I don't know if it's so much a smaller scale as a different goal for land use, because I do, you know, I work in the small scale of people's backyards, but also in wildland, unmanaged, ungrazed habitat areas. And yeah, I would say the same. Depending on the weeds that you're looking at, selective use of herbicides can be really effective. After the 2007, it was the cedar fire in some of the areas that burned in San Diego County. Some of our colleagues did do some large-scale aerial application of, not sure which herbicides they used, but likely glyphosate, in order to selectively reduce the growth of non-native species. And they had some pretty good success returning perennial grass areas, I believe, into desert. So it was more arid than what we have here. So I think in terms of soil disturbance, that's a really good approach that you often have available. grazing where it's possible can be another really effective approach. And if you're grazing for invasive species control, it may be that you select other species. So it may be goats more than cattle in some areas. Of course, if you're grazing to produce beef, then you're going to want to go with cattle. The other thing that I would say is, a lot of the goal of this project that I did was, and it's a long haul kind of goal, is just source reduction. So one of the reasons we have some of these invasive species is because people have chosen to plant them, either for forage production, erosion control, or because they thought they were fire resistant. So I think getting those out of recommended plantings, getting those out of seed mixes where seed's going to be applied is really valuable. On a positive note, so post-fire, one of the advantages that you have in areas where you want to manage invasive species is that you've got a real reduction in the biomass. And dealing with the biomass for something like Arundo, for example, can be one of the most expensive parts of treatment. So there's an opportunity to see things come up and potentially apply herbicide where you can, maybe in a more site-specific manner, because you can see the new seedlings coming up. The other thing that would be really useful, and I kind of need to get together with the folks on some of the parklands in Ventura on this, is going out now for things like pasture bean and just deadheading them. Without necessarily needing to kill the entire weed, we could cut back the seed bed if we went out now when they're flowering and just starting to produce seed and just cut off those seed head and just continue to do that. So it's always kind of a labor versus cost estimate. I've worked on a lot of invasive projects where people really adamantly don't want to use herbicide, and it's like, okay, you can do that, but you need to be prepared for an intensive amount of labor that needs to be replaced. Say they're going to volunteer stuff, and they get tired after a couple months, and they don't keep going back. So there's all those kinds of full management issues there. But yeah, source reduction would be the other big thing, and recognizing that going out and pulling invasive weeds can cause soil disturbance. I do a lot in riparian areas, and it can really damage streams, not just fire scenarios. So balancing all of those things. In the station fire area, the Forest Service finally, years and years, did get permission to apply herbicide, but that was specific to the station fire burn area in Angeles National Forest, not a Forest Service-wide policy. I actually don't know if folks in Los Padres are trying to pursue the same NEPA exemption.
I just spoke with the botanist from Los Padres actually this morning, and he described they're working on a forest-wide NEPA document that would allow them to apply herbicide for just these sort of situations. So, and that's set to come through the beginning of next calendar year.
I don't have as much experience with the herbicide treatments because typically NRCS doesn't recommend herbicides, but I agree with everything else both Sabrina and Matthew said, with a couple of caveats or additions. One I'd already mentioned in my presentation was getting after populations when they're small. We typically wait till things get massive before we decide we have a problem. And I always say get after those small populations. And the bigger populations, manage the bigger populations so that they don't get bigger. So, I mean, it's a long-term process. It's not an over-the-night thing. I think also plant competition over time. So better plants, more advantageous plants that can compete with undesirables is a way of managing undesirables. But again, that's something that doesn't take place overnight, and it's knowing what plants will be good plants to compete with the ones that you don't want there. But there again, there's a fine line at when you do this, particularly after fire, because you think it's a perfect opportunity, but at the same time, are you making more disturbances to the soil and causing erosion issues and potential sliding issues and slope stability issues. But timing is huge. It's huge when it comes to just removing the plant. Some people say any time you remove a weed's a good time. Well, sometimes you could be just spreading seed by removing a bad plant, depending on what that plant is. If it's castor bean or it's thistle or it's French broom or something. Wrong time of the year, you have a weed removal program, and you could just be making the problem 10 times worse. When in your mind, you think you're making it better because you're removing the plant. So timing and getting before it produces viable seed head is when you get the most bang for your buck.
To add, I realize now you had an additional question about the use of native seed to kind of tip the scales. So when I give talks to the general public, simplifying situations a little bit, I would say generally seeding bad, not needed, waste of money. It depends on your goals though, and as Matthew pointed out, if forage production is your goal, there are cases where maybe it does make a lot of sense. There are areas of high severity burn where we're not seeing native seeds recover, where potentially seeding is going to be of value. The problem is it has to be done really, really carefully with the input of really well-trained botanists. So there were some folks, after the Thomas fire who people really wanted to do something. And sometimes doing nothing is the best thing to do, and it feel good to do nothing. Not kind of how human beings are built. And so people were creating seed bombs with native seed mixes, but the problem is really native to the area that you're introducing the seed. Or there was another group who wanted to spread poppy seeds everywhere. Well, that would drown out the biodiversity of native seed banks, which aren't meant to be all poppy. Generally, too, there's the idea that you spread a lot of seed and what is already in the seed bank, if it hasn't been a super high severity burn, it's probably what ought to be there in the amounts that they ought to be there, in the species composition that ought to be there. So there may be cases where seeding is valuable and necessary, and especially where there's a lot of invasive species and you do invasive species control, but the area has been so impacted for so long where it has type converted that the seed bank isn't really available there anymore where it is necessary, but it just really has to be done carefully. And there's a movement now to create more native plant nurseries for restoration projects, kind of a dearth of the availability of plants. And I think that that's really great because, again, that seed, it really needs to be hyper-local and it needs to be applied very judiciously.
Out of respect for our time, we're past 8:30, and this poor young lady up here, Jo, has been going nonstop for 2.5 hours. Unless someone else has a burning question, no pun intended, would like to do is end our time together. I want to thank our 3 speakers who came here of their own time and volition. Round of applause for them all. Also, a round of applause to Jo, our American Sign Language interpreter. Thank you, Jo, for your services. I also want to thank Montecito Covenant Church and Sandy and Mike for their willingness to accommodate us in their beautiful sanctuary tonight. And so, thank you, Montecito Covenant Church. Our speakers are going to stick around for a short while, so if you have one-on-one questions, they're a wealth of knowledge and information, obviously. And so, with that, I'd like to end our time. Yes, so we have a viewing audience. So all these materials that were put out on the table for the folks in our church audience, that'll be available on the Ready SBC website. On your way out, please take as much of that information as you want for your family, friends, and neighbors, because we brought obviously plenty. There's refreshments out there too. Please grab them on your way out. That way I don't have to take it home. I'd appreciate that. Correct, which is just down the road. All the materials that have been included in tonight's presentation that are available out there on the table will be available at the Montecito Center. All right. Thank you all. Thank you for your time tonight. Have a good evening.